There are silences in history that scream, not the silence of gradual decline of empires softening slowly into irrelevance, of cultures dissolving generation by generation into the cultures that replace them. Those silences have explanations, causes, paper trails, tombstones. The silences that haunt archaeologists, historians, and dreamers are different. They are the silences of people who were there undeniably, magnificently, stubbornly there, and then were not. Cities abandoned mid-meal, cliff palaces sealed like tombs with no bodies inside. Entire fleets of warships described in the records of terrified empires, striking from nowhere and retreating into the sea. Civilizations that left behind their walls, and their pottery, and their art, and their grain, and their tools. Everything except an explanation. Two of history's greatest disappearances stand apart from all the others, separated by an ocean, by culture, by geography, and by nearly 1,000 years of human history. The ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest, known to history by the Navajo name Anasazi, meaning ancient ones or ancient enemies, and the Sea Peoples of the Bronze Age Mediterranean vanished from the historical record in ways so sudden, so complete, and so unexplained that they have driven scholars to obsession for generations. Their disappearances were not identical in character. The Anasazi left behind spectacular physical evidence and almost no written record. The Sea Peoples left behind written records of their devastation and almost no confirmed physical identity. Together, they represent the two most tantalizing cold cases in the history of human civilization. Mysteries. So deep that answering one question only opens three more. To understand what was lost, one must first understand what existed in the American Southwest, in the region where the modern states of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico converge at a geographic crossroads called the Four Corners. Civilization had been building for centuries before its sudden silence. This was not a primitive culture scratching existence from reluctant soil. This was a society of architects, astronomers, farmers, traders, and artists who constructed multi-story stone buildings of extraordinary sophistication without metal tools, without the wheel, and without draft animals. A road straight, engineered and purposeful, stretched across the desert landscape for hundreds of miles in directions that seemed to serve not commerce alone, but something more cosmic, more ceremonial, more deeply connected to their understanding of the universe and their place within it. Their great houses, centered at Chaco Canyon in what is now northwestern New Mexico, were aligned with astronomical precision to solar and lunar cycles that modern engineers have confirmed required multi-generational planning and observation. These were not people stumbling through existence. They were a civilization in full command of their environment, their society, and their spiritual life. And then, in the 12th and 13th century CE, they walked away. Not instantly. The abandonment was a process measured in decades rather than days. But measured against the centuries of occupation that preceded it, the depopulation of the Colorado Plateau was breathtakingly rapid. Great houses that had sheltered thousands fell silent. Ceremonial structures that had drawn pilgrims from across the Southwest were sealed and left. Agricultural systems that had sustained large populations across marginal desert land were abandoned. A network of roads built for purposes that still provoke debate among archaeologists was walked for the last time. The people moved, southward mostly, eastward, to the Rio Grande Valley. Two new pueblos that their descendants, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the modern Pueblo peoples, still inhabit today. They did not cease to exist. But whatever they had been at Chaco Canyon, whatever civilization had crystallized in those extraordinary stone buildings aligned to the movements of stars, that specific singular thing ended. Why? Across the world, separated by 9,000 miles and 1,000 years, a different disappearance was unfolding, one far more violent, far more geographically expansive, and in some ways even more mysterious because of the scale of what it had destroyed. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean world of roughly 1200 BCE was by the standards of its time, a globalized civilization of extraordinary complexity and achievement. Egypt under the New Kingdom pharaohs was at the height of its imperial power, its temples soaring above the Nile floodplain in statements of divine permanence. The Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, had matched Egypt in military power and matched it diplomatically. The two great powers had even negotiated. History's earliest known peace treaty after the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, a document whose clay tablet copy survives to this day. The Mycenaean civilization of Greece built palace complexes and maintained trading networks that spanned the Aegean. Cyprus was a major center of copper production and maritime trade. The cities of the Levantine coast, Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, Kaya, connected Mediterranean trade routes to the great civilizations of Mesopotamia. Merchants carried tin from Afghanistan to Cyprus, turned it into bronze with Cypriot copper, shipped the finished metal to Egypt, Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant, and returned with grain, textiles, wine, and luxury goods. The system worked because everyone within it depended on everyone else. It was, by any reasonable definition, civilization at its most interconnected and its most vulnerable. Within 50 years, between roughly 1200 and 1150 BCE, almost all of it collapsed. The Hittite Empire, which had endured for 5 centuries, ceased to exist. Its capital, Hattusa, was burned and abandoned. Mycenaean Greek palace civilization collapsed. Linear B script, the administrative language of those palaces, was forgotten so completely that it was not deciphered until 1952 CE, 3,000 years after the last scribe had written it. Ugarit, one of the most sophisticated trading cities of the ancient world, was destroyed and never rebuilt. Cyprus was devastated. Egypt survived barely and in diminished form, but the new kingdom that followed the crisis was a shadow of the imperial colossus that had preceded it. The intricate Bronze Age trading network that had sustained Mediterranean civilization for centuries fragmented, contracted, and in many places simply stopped functioning. A dark age settled over the Aegean that lasted 3 centuries, and from which the historical record emerges only with the earliest writings of Homer, who was himself recording, in epic form, the dim mythologized memory of the world that had been lost. In the Egyptian records that survive this catastrophe, a repeated, terrifying phrase appears. The Sea Peoples. They came from the sea. They came in ships. They came in numbers sufficient to overwhelm civilizations that had stood for centuries. They fought in ways Egyptian scribes found extraordinary, disciplined, coordinated, combining naval and land operations with sophistication that impressed even the soldiers of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. Pharaoh Ramesses III, who fought them at the Battle of the Delta around 1175 BCE, recorded their assault in carved reliefs at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu that still stand today. The most detailed military narrative to survive from the Bronze Age collapse. He depicted their ships, their warriors, their women and children traveling with the fighting forces in ox carts, suggesting not raiders seeking plunder, but migrants seeking new land. He named their groups the Peliset, the Jeker, the Shekelesh, the Denayan, the Washesh, names that scholars have spent 2 centuries attempting to connect to known ancient peoples with only partial success. He claimed to have destroyed them, driven them back, preserved Egypt from their assault. But Egypt was not the same afterward, and the civilization they had swept through on their way to Egypt's borders was simply gone. Who were the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? Why did they appear at precisely the moment when Bronze Age civilization was most extended and most vulnerable? Why, having devastated everything in their path, do they disappear from the historical record almost as thoroughly as the civilizations they destroyed? 2 peoples, 2 disappearances, 2 silences that have lasted millennia. The investigation begins here. Civilizations do not appear from nothing. They are built, generation by patient generation, from small decisions accumulating into patterns, from patterns crystallizing into culture, from culture hardening into identity. The Ancestral Puebloans and the Sea Peoples were not accidents of history. They were the products of centuries of adaptation, innovation, survival in environments that demanded constant ingenuity from the people they shaped. The story of the ancestral Puebloans begins not with the great houses of Chaco, the canyon, but with their ancestors, the basket makers, as modern archaeologists have named them, who occupied the Colorado Plateau for centuries before the architectural flowering that would become the civilization's defining achievement. These early inhabitants of the Four Corners region were not farmers by origin. They were hunters and gatherers, people who knew their landscape with the intimate, encyclopedic knowledge that comes from complete dependency upon it. They understood the seasonal movements of game, the locations of water in a terrain where water was never guaranteed, the subtle ecological patterns of a high desert environment that could support life abundantly in good years and threaten it with lethal efficiency in bad ones. This knowledge was not incidental to their survival. No, it was survival itself, carried in.